Part 3, Chapter 14, Changing One's Fate. To defend yourself in the savage world was impossible. To go on strike was suicide. To go on hunger strikes was useless. And as for dying, there would always be time. So what was left for the prisoner? To break out. To go change one's fate. Chekhov used to say that if a prisoner was not a philosopher who could get along equally well in all possible circumstances, or let us put it this way, who could retire into himself, then he could not but wish to escape, and he ought to wish to. He could not but wish to. That was the imperative of a free soul. True, the natives of the archipelago were far from being like that. They were much more submissive than that. But even among them there were always those who thought about escape or who were just about to. The continual escapes in one or another place, even those that did not succeed, were a true proof that the energy of the Zeks had not yet been lost. Here is a camp compound. It is well guarded. The fence is strong and the inner cordon area is reliable and the watchtowers are set out correctly. Every spot is open to view and open to fire. But all of a sudden you grow sick to death of the thought that you are condemned to die right here, on this bit of fenced-off land. So why not try your luck? Why not burst out and change your fate? This impulse is particularly strong at the beginning of your term of imprisonment. In the first year, and it is not even deliberate. In that first year when, generally speaking, the prisoner's entire future and whole prison personality are being decided. Later on, this impulse weakens somehow. There is no longer the conviction that it is more important for you to be out there, and all the threads binding you to the outer world weaken, and the cauterizing of the soul is transformed into decay, and the human being settles into camp harness. During all the years of the camps, there were evidently quite a few escapes. Here are some statistics accidentally come by. In the month of March 1930 alone, 1,328 persons escaped from imprisonment in the RSFSR, and how inaudible and soundless this was in our society. With the enormous development of the archipelago after 1937, particularly during the war years, when the battle-fit infantrymen were rounded up and sent to the front, it became even more difficult to provide proper convoy, and not even the evil notion of self-guarding could solve all the problems of the chiefs. So they relied on certain invisible chains which kept the natives reliably in their place. The strongest of these chains was the prisoners' universal submission and total surrender to their situation as slaves. Almost to a man, both the 58s and the non-political offenders were hard-working family people capable of manifesting valor only in lawful ways, on the orders of and the approval of the higher-ups. Even when they had been imprisoned for 5 and 10 years, they could not imagine that singly, or, God forbid, collectively, they might rise up for their liberty, since they saw arrayed against them the state, their own state, the NKVD, the police, the guards, and the police dogs. And even if you were fortunate enough to escape unscathed, how could you live afterward on a false passport, with a false name, when documents were checked at every intersection, when suspicious eyes followed passers-by from behind every gateway? Another chain was the death factory, camp starvation, although it was precisely this starvation that at times drove the despairing to wander through the taiga in hope of finding more food than there was in camp. Yet it was this starvation that also weakened them, so that they had no strength for a long flight. And because of it, it was impossible to save up a stock of food for the journey. And there was another chain, too, the threat of a new term. A political prisoner was given a new tenor for an escape attempt under that same Article 58, and gradually it proved best to give Article 58-14, counter-revolutionary sabotage. Another thing restraining the Zeks was not the compound, but the privilege of going without convoy. The ones guarded the least, who enjoyed the small privilege of going back to work and back, without a bayonet at their backs, or once in a while dropping into the free settlement, highly prized their advantages, and after an escape these were taken away. The geography of the archipelago was also a solid obstacle to escape attempts. Those endless expanses of snow or sandy desert, tundra, taiga. The hostility of the surrounding population, encouraged by the authorities, became the principal hindrance to escapes. The authorities were not stingy about rewarding the captors. This was an additional form of political indoctrination. And the nationalities inhabiting the areas around Gulag gradually came to assume that the capture of a fugitive meant a holiday, enrichment, that it was like a good hunt or finding a small golden nugget. But the desperate heart sometimes did not weigh things. It saw. The river was flowing and a log was floating down it, and one jump will float on down. Vyacheslav Bezrodny, from the Olchan camp, barely released from the hospital, still utterly weak, escaped down the Indigirka River on 2 logs fastened together, to the Arctic Ocean. Where was he going, and what was he hoping for? In the end, he was not so much caught as picked up on the open sea and returned over the winter road to Olchan to that very same hospital. It is not possible to say of everyone who didn't return to camp on his own, who was not brought in half alive, or who was not brought in dead, that he had escaped. Perhaps he had only exchanged an involuntary and long-drawn-out death in camp for the free death of a beast in the taiga. The quiet escapees were usually more fortunate in their results. Some of them were surprisingly successful, but we rarely hear of these happy stories. Those who broke out do not give interviews. They have changed their names, and they are in hiding. Kuzakov Skachinsky, who escaped successfully in 1942, tells the story now only because he was caught in 1959, after 17 years. And we have learned of the successful escape of Zinaida Yakovlevna Povalyayaeva, because in the end it fell through. She got her term because she had stayed on as a teacher in her school during the German occupation, but she was not immediately arrested when the Soviet armies arrived, and before her arrest, she was married to a pilot. Then she was arrested and sent to mine number 8 at Vorkuta. Through some Chinese working in the kitchen, she established communication with Freedom and her husband. He was employed in civil aviation and arranged a trip to Vorkuta for himself. On an appointed day, Zina went to the bath in the work zone, where she shed her camp clothing and released her hair, which had been curled the night before, from under her headscarf. Her husband was waiting for her in the work sector. There were security officers on duty at the river ferry, but they paid no attention to a girl with curly hair who was arm in arm with a flyer. They flew out on a plane. Zina spent 1 year living on false papers, but she couldn't resist the desire to see her mother again, and her mother was under surveillance. At her new interrogation, she managed to convince them that she had escaped in a coal car, and they never did find out about her husband's participation. We have not yet described the group escapes, and there were many of them too. They say that in 1956 a whole small camp escaped near Monchegorsk. The history of all escapes from the archipelago would be a list too long to be read, too long to be leafed through, and any one person who wrote a book solely about escapes, to spare his reader and himself, would be forced to omit hundreds of cases. End of Part 3, Chapter 14.